Hello and welcome to the Circle's next instalment of our VEvent series. I'll just wait for a moment before we get started. Our audience is still joining us, so bear with us as they all connect and come through. I'll just wait. Great, I'll get started. I know there's a few more coming in. But hopefully they'll pick this up on the way through. For those of you who are just joining us now, welcome to the next instalment of the Circle's VEvent series, Resilient Leadership in Challenging Times. And thank you to our partners today of this entire series, in fact, Commonwealth Bank, IBM, Red Hat and ServiceNow. I'd like to acknowledge the original custodians of this land. I'm coming to you from the land of the Eora people, and I pay our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, for they hold the hopes, visions and traditions of Indigenous Australia. To date in this series, we've had 29 amazing leaders so far, and they've joined us and they've taken us through their individual pandemic experiences. We're now in our 7th week of the series, and haven't we seen some unbelievable transformations in business and government? But more importantly, we've heard from real human stories and their human stories. At the Business Circle, we've been humbled by the openness of each of our guest speakers in these sessions. And we've also heard from all of you out there in our audience on how you're coping professionally and personally. So thanks for joining us each day and supporting us. We have been getting your feedback in our post-event surveys, in your emails, and also in your phone calls. And I just want to let you know that we are listening. So today in our 30th guest of honour, the Honourable Bligh AC, we have a truly remarkable leader. Anna, thank you for agreeing to sit down with us today. Your compassion, your authenticity and ultimately your resilient leadership in the Queensland floods, which is now almost 10 years ago, was something that really struck me at the time as an impressionable emerging leader. And I remember watching you and thinking, that's the kind of leader that I aspire to be. Since early 2017, you have held the position of CEO at the ABA, the Australian Banking Association, and you've really been leading the organisation's work to improve public awareness and understanding the banking industry's contribution to the economy in Australia, but also the community. And we look forward to hearing from you today. So please, everyone out there, take this time to really submit your questions. This is your absolute opportunity to get in there and ask anything that you've been burning to ask. You'll find our Q&A feature down the bottom there, and just submit your questions through there. And in regards to our moderator, I have the great pleasure in announcing that Renee Leon is joining us today. And for those of you in our international audience who are not familiar with Renee, Renee is a former senior public servant. Most recently, she was the Secretary of Human Services, and she's really been leading and transforming the Australian government's national service delivery network. So we're delighted to have her here today to take us through all the questions. So thank you, Renee, for joining us. And with that, I'll hand over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Tracy, and really so pleased to have you with us today, Anna. As we talk about resilient leadership in challenging times, you are particularly well qualified to talk about it, given the challenges that you've been through as a leader, and one, of course, of which Tracy mentioned when you were universally and justly praised for your leadership during the Queensland floods, which I'm sure doesn't feel like 10 years ago to you either. Just as a good introduction to all of the challenges that we face now, what do you feel were really the most important qualities that you brought to being the leader that was needed for Queensland at that time?
Well, good morning and thank you to the Trans-Tasman Business Circle. It's great to be here and to explore some of these themes, and I'm looking forward to hearing questions and comments from those who've joined you this morning. Look, I think it's difficult to sort of bottle all of those complex things that go together to make it all work in a moment of crisis. But I think every leader, every day, walks a fine line and tries to find the right balance between what you might call command and control type leadership versus, empathetic and collaborative, and to get that balance right. And in my experience, when there is a significant crisis on, particularly one where, life and death is actually at stake, it is much more important to be on the command and control side for much of the event. And but what I mean by that is, people need to see leaders at that moment being decisive. And, mostly in politics, you do have the opportunity when you're making decisions, to consult with peers, to find, best global examples, to take advice from a range of different voices. In the middle of a, very extreme crisis, you don't have that. And so that ability, one, to be decisive, to be the one who'll make the call, but then I think much more importantly, the ability to live with the consequences of the call, and for everybody around you to know that you're taking responsibility for that call. You make the call, you know that if it goes wrong, they know that if it ends up being the wrong call, you are still the person who's going to take it on their shoulders. So some of the things we had to decide during those floods, that never got a lot of airplay, but so we had to relocate all of the patients from Cairns Base Hospital when it looked like the cyclone was going to hit that hospital. That included, a number of ICU patients, neonatal ICU patients. It's still the largest, medical evac in Australian history. Luckily, and we did it all on the tarmac of Cairns Airport over a 12-hour period using military aircraft and transporting and stabilising about 450 patients. In the end, the cyclone didn't hit the hospital, but you don't know that when you've got 24 hours to make the decision. And luckily, every patient survived that evacuation. But if that hadn't been the case, if we'd lost, neonatal patients in that transfer and the cyclone hadn't hit, these were really big calls. And literally you had an hour to make a decision because the window was closing to get people out. So actually living with that responsibility for what might have ended up being, not the right decision, or a decision that had very bad outcomes. And I think for me, the other thing is, and it's probably contained a bit in what I've already said, is a high degree of comfort with uncertainty and ambiguity. One of my favourite sayings about leadership is that leadership is what you see when the rule book runs out. And I remember and I hadn't heard that saying at the time, but I remember literally in the middle of it all thinking on some days, where is the recipe book? This was something nobody had done, not even the most experienced emergency services personnel in the country. Nobody had ever done it. So, and that is a high degree of uncertainty and ambiguity, and you can't be decisive and take responsibility unless you've got a high degree of comfort. And I think, having said what I said about decisive command and control type leadership, I do think people want to see you there most of the time, but actually having the ability to switch, to empathy very quickly when at the right moments when people really need you on that side of the equation.
Well, all of those qualities are ones that you're not just talking about them. We all saw you demonstrate them. Did you know you had it in you to be like that and to do that extremely difficult thing? Or did you discover it really in the heat of the crisis and having to keep on pushing through and carrying that responsibility throughout?
Probably a bit of both, Renee. Queensland is a tropical state, and it's no stranger to floods or cyclones or major storms. And I had certainly lived through floods before, but they had been contained in one small place. And so by the time that really big one came, I'd had a lot of opportunity to live through the experience, learn from them. And I think most importantly, I'd had the opportunity to work at really close quarters, like literally sleeping in evacuation centres with the police commissioner, the head of emergency services, and to know the people that I could absolutely have confidence in. So when the really big one came, that team was already, including myself in that team, was, quite close-knit, and a couple of my staff had been through that as well. So, I walked into it feeling like I had some preparation, but every day it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and you felt yourself having to stretch more and more and more to meet the challenge of it. I was also, just acutely conscious that I didn't have a lot of time. Well, I didn't have the luxury, not the time, I didn't have the luxury of sitting around and examining myself. That every single person around me and everybody at the other end of the, television screens and media and message was literally fearful of their life. and that I just had to every day get up and do what had to be done. So there was that sense of discipline and purpose that, you know, anyone who's been in politics, particularly in a leadership position, it doesn't matter what side of politics, you walk into any Premier's office or Prime Minister's office, they have 4 or 5 crises every day. And they're not necessarily life and death, but they have the same sense of potential panic about them. So there was a lot of that I think did prepare me. And I often say in these kinds of sessions, I think the other thing for me, which I only really reflected on in hindsight, is how much, you know, when you have to pull something out of yourself that you've never done before, how much of the sort of what you might call instinct, that life actually lays down those layers. And if I really think about the times when I have been personally tested and learnt something about my ability to do something tough, it's as much or more often been in my personal life than it has been in my professional life. And that you actually draw on all of those things. So, you know, when you're the mother of small children, you go through extraordinarily testing times when your children's lives are at stake. Even things like losing them in a supermarket. You know, these are moments of abject terror in which you have to be the person who calmly, collectively makes logical decisions and resolves the situation. And all of those things, I think it's important for people to remember that you've all been through them. And when the big moment comes, they are there to call on, even if they happened 20 years ago.
Great insights, Anna. And you've been out of the public leadership roles, public sector leadership roles for a few years now, but I imagine given the crises that you've been through at the ABA as well, you'd find that there's plenty of similarities between what's called on for you as a public sector leader and a private sector leader. Any reflections on the similarities or the differences of what you have to do in the private sector in a leadership role?
To be honest, I don't experience a lot of difference. You know, leadership, the requirements of leadership are the requirements of leadership, whether you're, you know, head of the school P&C or, you know, running the country. I do think the public, not so much the public, but the political, when it's political leadership, there's lots of other public sector leaders, you know, heads and police commissioners, etc., who don't experience, I think, quite the same thing. But Australia has a very robust democracy, and that is a very good thing. And one of its features is that everybody and every voter in Australia, you know, feels at complete liberty to be constantly making, you know, you're doing the work under public commentary all the time. And I think for me, there was a bit of, well, there was a lot of learning, and then becomes a bit of an art of being able to take the slings and arrows and not be distracted from the task at hand. You know, there's 4 million people who know how to do the job better than you, and they're happy to write letters to the editor about it every day. And as I said, it's a great strength of our democracy, but you could easily find yourself being very battered from, you know, side to side. And I think in the private sector, it's not that it's without public scrutiny, but it's not quite at the same level.
So we're in the middle of another crisis that's affecting the globe and the nation and all of us now. What lessons do you think you're bringing from your career to date that are helping you to help both the banking industry, but also all the people who depend on the banking industry to navigate this crisis?
You know, as I said earlier, for me, I think one of the definitions of a crisis is you're making very high stakes decisions in very suboptimal circumstances. And so that, I think that issue around decisiveness is still, regardless of whether it's a natural disaster or a pandemic or whatever the nature of the crisis is. And part of decisiveness is not just making the decisions that are in front of you, but I think the task of leadership at times like this is thinking about what this is going to be like tomorrow. What is it likely to be like next week? What's likely to be unfolding in a month and beyond and into recovery. So at really focusing and tackling on the, you know, the very important decisions that have to be made sometimes every 5 minutes, you know, right now, but not losing sight of, actually, we need to be also putting a team up that aren't attached to daily tasks and getting them thinking about, you know, what do we need to be doing next week?
Mm.
So, you know, that's always, I think, the task of leadership, but it is very much writ large in a crisis, because you could find yourself totally absorbed by the demands of the hourly decisions that have to be made and the calls that have to be made. But actually, leaders have to, the job of leading is to lead people out of it, is to actually lead them out of the crisis, not just, you know, lead them on the, you know, in the hurly-gurly. It's actually, let's get out of here. And so that looking around the corner, looking over the horizon, I think is a really critical, a critical part of it. That doesn't matter what kind of crisis it is. And one of the things that I think I've, you know, experienced many times and had to really have that focus in the middle of the maelstrom.
Of course, you had a bit of a maelstrom as a practice run with the Banking Royal Commission not long before. And I'm sure that had its challenging and torrid moments as well. What lessons do you think that both you, but also probably the whole industry, might have taken from that have actually helped you to step up to this crisis?
Well, I think one of the recurring themes from the Royal Commission, and one that Commissioner Hayne returned to over and over and over again, was the need for, you know, acknowledging the privileged and important and special role that banks hold in the community. Then there is a need for them to not only comply with the law, but to go well above that and to meet the expectations of the community. And those expectations are writ large when there is an economic crisis. So I think the banks certainly, I think if you've watched what they've done over the last 3 months, I think it's fair. It's a fair assessment to say they heard that message and they have responded accordingly. And the conversations that they're having around the table, you know, 3 months ago and today, you know, what would the community expect us to do? Are we able to do it? How do we do it? How do we get people? We've got a critical role to play here. And banks, I think the community expects that banks, you know, with their big capital buffers and their enormous footprint and the impact they have on every Australian, to use their buffers to be the shock absorber in the economy. And frankly, if they weren't doing that right now, then it would be households who were absorbing the shock, and that would be catastrophic. So yes, I think that the big theme was living up to the community expectations. Australians have very high expectations, and I think that you've seen banks really step up and try to do that since the beginning of COVID.
Yeah. I loved that story about how you successfully evacuated that whole ICU and hospital using military planes and on the Cairns airport, and it's not something most people know about or talk about. What do you think you'll be saying, you know, 6 months or 6 years after this crisis, as some of the examples of the really great sort of community stories that people might not remember? They all probably know about the mortgage deferrals and the refinancing assistance that's going on, but are there stories that you think you'll be telling 5 years from now about the community help the banks gave that we might not all know about?
Well, I think the other thing about this year to remember is that it started with bushfires. Mm-hmm. And you know, many of the customers who are now experiencing COVID-related hardship have also experienced bushfires, and there are, you know, lots of very personal stories there about banks working in particular communities or working in partnership with other companies to get, you know, to get things that are just as basic as, you know, shipping containers for people to live in temporarily and those sorts of things. But I think right now, I mean, I do think the single biggest thing that banks have done is allow people to defer their loan repayments. And we've already had, you know, we get messages in all the time to our office about, you know, basically that's made the difference. I will be able to survive because of that. I now have confidence that my business is going to make it and I'm going to be able to look after my family. And I don't know what I would have done otherwise. You know, we've currently got 703,000 loans with deferred payments in Australia, and 429,000 of those are mortgages. You know, this is without precedent, and, you know, gives you a sense of how many Australians would be in absolutely dire circumstances if they hadn't had access to that. But I think the stories behind that are actually the interesting ones. I mean, these guys are actually very fierce competitors. You know, they're always out trying to, you know, the mortgage market in Australia is very lucrative and very competitive. And so for those decisions to be made, particularly very early, you know, it was sort of week 1, week 2, it was actually, those conversations started the week before the Prime Minister closed down, or the Premier, clubs and pubs. And that was really the beginning of what became a sort of much more prolonged shutdown. To have those people around the table effectively being required to collaborate on things that they would never disclose to each other was not an easy process for them. You know, they came to the table wanting to do the right thing, but we had, you know, literally 3 or 4 meetings over a 5-day period of all of the CEOs, and you could almost feel some of them going, oh, I can't, oh. You know, like wanting to do the right thing by their own customers, but not wanting to necessarily do it jointly with their competitors, and almost a competitive spirit about, well, maybe I can offer my customers something that you're not going to offer your customers, which is a good instinct, and we want them to keep that at the other end. But in this instance, if we'd had 15 banks, you know, Australia's largest 15 largest retail banks, all having a different approach to helping their customers, it would be chaos out there. You know, at times like this, people need simple, clear, consistent advice and information. And, you know, you just can't go out and communicate 15 bespoke. So, you know, people knew that in their head, but actually getting to the point of agreeing on consistency and collaboration. So that was very interesting. And going back to your question around public and private, while there's always plenty of competition between government departments, it's not the same thing as commercial competitiveness. And, you know, ultimately government departments, while they might be competitive sometimes, their mandate is to be collaborative in the public interest. That is not the mandate for banks. It is to be competitive in the public interest. And so actually drawing on their collaborative instincts versus their competitive ones, I think for all of them will be one of the things that they'll reflect on as well.
I did want to ask you a bit about your work or your bank's workforce as well, because I'm sure many of the people online are going through the kinds of things that that you've had to handle in the banking industry, about people working from home, the mental health toll that sometimes is taking on people who, especially women, I think, who are doing a lot, even more juggling than they used to do, and the managerial challenges that working from home has sometimes brought. Can you share a bit with us about how banking is handling the work from home workforce issues?
Well, banking, of course, is an essential service, and branches, call centres have all been fully operational. And so much of the banking workforce hasn't been working from home. It's been out. And so some of the bigger issues there have been ensuring that those staff felt protected. So at the branch level, you know, early challenges, as many people did, have about appropriate PPE, ensuring social distancing, going around measuring, you know, facilities and how many people could be there. So giving staff the confidence that they could actually continue to work in the branch where they were handling cash, being in direct contact with customers. And, you know, so, and that, I think it's interesting in banking. I mean, having worked a lot with people like police and firefighters and even nurses, they think of themselves as frontline responders, first responders and essential services. And it's actually one of the things that attracts them to the job. I don't think that bank tellers think of themselves in that same kind of way. So giving them confidence to continue to be at the front line was a very big issue for banks. And again, one of the things we did, which we don't normally do, is bring together a sector-wide working group of heads of people and culture to make sure that everyone was sharing good practice, because it was such an unknown event, so that it didn't matter what bank you worked for, you could be, you know, assured that you would have very similar protections, etc. But they do also have one of the largest scale, you know, shifts out of the head office and off to home. They were very concerned at the beginning about whether the system, you know, would actually allow it to happen, and it has, not the bank system, but basically the capability of the internet and related services. So and worried that as more and more people would be using their digital banking devices and facilities, what sort of strain that might put on their system. But again, that has worked by and large. There's, obviously hiccups here and there, but by and large been very successful. And I know from talking to senior people in banks, and I know one of the issues that has really concerned that group, the heads of people and culture, has been how do we ensure we keep people at least virtually together, make them still feel that they're part of their team, ensuring that their isolation is not contributing to any, to mental health problems. And I think that's been a very personal, I know that bank CEOs and a number of them have talked to me about that real sense of my team is scattered to the four winds. What's my role as a leader and what are we doing as an organisation to make sure they're okay, to make sure they've got what they need to do their work well, that we're not putting too many onerous requirements on them. But more than that, how do we actually ensure social connection, not just to the organisation, but more importantly to each other? And I remember one CEO said to me, he went into the office on the day after Easter and he went up in the lift with a junior member of staff that he didn't recognise and said to her, "Oh, how was your Easter?" And it was just the two of them in the lift. And she said, "Oh, actually, I was very lonely." And how much it really struck him that in BAU, no one would tell the CEO that, that was obviously a very profound experience that she'd had. And one of the reasons she had come into the office that day was just to overcome that sense of loneliness. And so I think they're very personal stories that people are, systematically trying to work through and help people.
There are so many lessons we're going to learn from this crisis, aren't there? From, the ones that you've mentioned and many more. I might just take us to some of the audience Q&A now, because it won't surprise you to know plenty of people have got things they'd like to hear from you on. We have one question that a number of people are interested in, which is what impact you think this crisis and its recovery is going to have on corporate governance and the future of work. What do you think we're going to see after this is, if not over, then at least digested?
I think there's going to be a lot of very big questions in corporate Australia, and not only in boardrooms, but in trade unions and from staff themselves and from customers. So what we've seen during the crisis in banking, we've seen changed customer and consumer behaviour across the economy. And the way it's manifested in banking, it won't surprise you, is that what was already a steady decline in the use of branches and an increase in use of digital banking options has accelerated rapidly. 10 years of disruption in 3 months. So, digital channels, considerably higher uptake and use. So questions there about when the economy fully opens up, to what extent that will continue, you don't know. To what extent people will want to come back into branches, to what extent they've changed a habit of a lifetime and changed it forever is yet to be, seen and worked through. And cashlessness, during the most of the last 2 months, many merchants have said they won't take cash as a way of protecting their own staff from handling material that might be contaminated. And so those people who still like to have $100 in their wallet, less and less and less. So significantly less demand for cash, significantly lower withdrawals from ATMs. Now that, again, people who love to have cash and like to, the comfort and security of it, as soon as this lifts and those merchants go back to taking cash, who knows how those customers will go. One of the things that the system did during this, through the payment system, was lift the pay wave limit from $100 to $200, so that people didn't even have to, put their PIN number in. So I suspect much higher use of pay wave. going forward. So what does that all look like? What does that mean for things like the checking, checks? They were already in significant decline. Again, lower use. But I'm sure people are sitting at home with checks they haven't cashed, and they'll be into the branch when they need to. I think more broadly across corporate Australia, and I noticed in the Financial Times on the weekend, a report that Twitter had sent out globally to its employees, basically a message saying you can work from home forever, that they had found it had been, so it had worked so well, and that they'd surveyed their employees and basically said you can work from home forever. I think there are going to be very big questions about, line of sight management versus, outcomes, managing to outcomes. And a lot of people who I think have had a lot of discomfort about that, that's probably changed for them. And I'm talking senior executives. You've had to make it work, and lo and behold, it seems to have worked. So those questions. And I suspect there's probably some big questions around corporate travel. For a long time, we've had the ability to have meetings like this, and we haven't taken it. And now that we have, I think people have found that instead of spending almost a day to go to a 2.5-hour meeting in Melbourne from Sydney, they can just have the 2-hour meeting and then have a much more productive day than sitting in an airport lounge. So, I think that's just a suite of things, but many, many things about how customers and consumers have actually changed behaviour. One thing I will say on the cash, we were very conscious, several weeks back, particularly, the advice was if you're 70 and over, you should be staying at home. You should barely be going out. And there were certainly people who were in quarantine and in lock and who couldn't go out because of suspected or a positive diagnosis. And often elderly people who don't have a debit card. So we did the biggest ever rollout of debit cards the country's ever seen to all of those customers. And just in terms of the kind of habits that are being changed, I think it would surprise a lot of people to know that there are still 500,000 Australians who have a passbook account and use it as their regular banking tool, and who do not have a debit card attached to that passbook account. So I don't expect that 500,000 of them took up the debit card, but for many of them, they will have. One of their adult family members will have shown them how to use it. And, they may well become, digital bankers as a result.
And when I was running human services, one of the things that we used to take a lot of joy in was if you got someone connected to one, especially an older person, one aspect of online life, because they had to get a MyGov account or something like that, it opened up so much more of the services that our community has available to it online. So it's hugely liberating for older people to discover that they can do that online thing. And that could be one of the really great outcomes of this.
No, I'm having Zoom meetings with my mother now, which she would never have contemplated.
Yeah. You spoke before about how banks had to learn a whole new level of listening to the community and being able to be empathetic and be seen to be empathetic during the Royal Commission and, of course, during the pandemic and the bushfires. During the recovery phase, of course, there'll be businesses that don't come through, and that eventually the forgiveness of debt will run out. How do you think the banks are going to walk that line of still keeping the community mindedness front and centre, but also you are running a business and you do have to take tough-minded decisions if the people who have borrowed money from you are not going to be able to keep repaying it? Have you started thinking about how you're going to walk that balance in the future?
Yes, we have started, and we've been working on this for a number of weeks now, and obviously some of the answers will be dependent on how regulators view those proposed solutions. I think one of the things that's been interesting to me throughout this is, again, going back to the Royal Commission, on the one hand, there was, a lot of very justified criticism of banks, but there was also some criticism of regulators and a suggestion from the Royal Commission that they had to take a much tougher approach on enforcement. And, I think out of the Royal Commission, that relationship with regulators and their enforcement stance had changed. And what the crisis did was actually, it demanded of the regulators very quickly that they respond to an entirely new set of circumstances. So, you know, the ACCC, whose primary mandate is to make sure that the competition law of this country is being enforced and being enforced fiercely, well, suddenly, you know, in the first couple of weeks, they spent all of their time writing authorisations for supermarkets and banks and, you know, other sectors to be sitting down and having conversations that they would normally never have allowed them to do. And that's what the community needed. They needed everybody to think, what do we actually need here, and to change the stance that they would normally take. So yes, we are working with regulators in, I think, a very important set of decisions about what happens at the end of these loan deferrals. And, you know, I think probably fair to say, I mean, I can't talk about it in too much detail at this moment, but certainly an understanding in banks that when we went into this with quite a blunt instrument, and that was, you know, 6 months deferral for everybody. And what's already clear is that some people don't need 6 months. Banks have already had mortgage customers ring them and say, I took this because I thought I was going to need it, or I was worried I was going to lose my job. As it turns out, I didn't, and I'm fine, and I want to start my repayments again. And obviously, the banks are letting them. It will be equally true, I think, that for some people, 6 months may not be long enough. And not so much because of their business, but because there is still a lot of uncertainty about which restrictions are going to be lifted in what way, by what date. And for banks and the customer to make a well-informed decision about whether this business is viable, there's going to need to be a longer period of forbearance of some kind. So there's a lot of unknowns in this, and it's also happening at a totally unprecedented volume. And not only banks are acutely aware of working with individual customers to work out, well, what's happening in your sector? Is there anything unique or particular we should take note of in terms of your location? You know, dependency on government decisions around restrictions. So you're in the tourism industry, you're in, you know, Great Barrier Reef, high exposure to international tourists. We need to have clarity. Before making a final judgment about this business, you'd need some clarity from the government about when they anticipate they will be lifting restrictions on national borders. So, and some of those decisions, I think, will not have been made by government at the point when these assessments have to be made. And because of the volume, banks are equally acutely aware, firstly, aware of the hardship potential for individual customers, but equally acutely aware that if you just move to some kind of mass enforcement action at large volume and scale, you could have very significant and serious impacts on local economies and local property markets. So there's an individual, there's an interest in looking after individuals, but there is, I think, an equal responsibility on banks to think consistently and work with government and regulators about how you can smooth the impact of this. You know, so there's not a cliff, but there's a series of step downs, and that's just got to be worked through. And we don't have the answers yet, but I did want to reassure people that no one's sitting around with their feet up saying, oh, well, we'll just see what happens. It's, you know, there's a lot of planning and thinking, and it will be more nuanced, I think, and more bespoke on the way out than it was on the way in, because you'll have more information.
Now, we're inundated with questions that I know we're not going to get to, Anna, but I might ask you a quick personal one before I hand back to Tracy, which is, what have you been doing to manage the sort of challenges of both the crisis and the working from home and the responsibility of so much of the economy resting on the decisions that you and your member or industry take? What are some tips that you have for people about how to come through this and to come out the other end still in one piece?
Look, like everybody else, my team has been working from home. We've started some staggered shifts this week for the first time, going back into the office. So I think we're in week 9 or 10 of, well, last week was week 9 of working from home. We're a small team, but having all the challenges of everybody having to, you know, work on the technology, get up to speed and for it to become a habit that, and my observation is that, productivity has actually been up for my team because of the challenges during this time. So the challenges of, or the constraints of doing things virtually has not had any impact. In fact, the reverse is true on productivity. At a very personal level, and I think these will be personal experiences for people, and I will preface this for everybody on the call who is not in this circumstance. I am not a mother of school-age children who has been homeschooling, and I think the experience is vastly different if you are someone in that circumstance, or a father. If you're a parent, a working parent at home trying to homeschool, particularly primary school-age children, I think that's been a tougher experience. But I'll be honest and say I've never worked from home for a day in my life before this happened. I've always been someone who wanted to be in the workplace. I was only at home if I was too sick to be in work. And I have found a lot about it to like, that a level of flexibility. And I think, I think the other thing I would say that everybody has a responsibility at these times, but particularly people in leadership positions, is, that constantly thinking about your team, because, they're the ones who are actually, holding you up. Mm. But there's also, I think, a real responsibility. And going back to your first question about qualities, in those extreme moments, I think one of the important things we don't talk about very much is keeping your eye on self-care. When you have to make big decisions, if you're not sleeping well, if you're highly stressed, if you're not, whatever it is for you, whether it's going for a ride on your bike or playing the piano or whatever it is, if you're not doing those things, you don't know when these things start, whether you're in a 2-day crisis or a 20-day crisis, or in this case, maybe a 6-month crisis. We're still going to be making decisions that will impact the livelihood, the well-being and the happiness of Australians and their families and their businesses well into the end of this year. And that means looking after yourself. And I'll be honest, sometimes I've been better at that than others.
It's a great note to end on, Anna. I know there is so much more we'd like to ask you, but it has been really generous of you to share your thoughts today. I'm going to hand back to Tanya now, who's going to do a bit of a an end of our broadcast poll. Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Renee. And of course, thank you, Anna. Amazing to have you with us during such busy times. And you really are an incredible leader. You somehow always get tested well, and you always rise to the occasion. So thank you for being with us and sharing such amazing insights, and your honesty and your heart and your intelligence. We really appreciate it. In front of you have the business sentiment poll. So if you'd like to just fill that in, we'll come back to you with the results after. The work that the Circle is doing would not be possible without some amazing corporates that have got behind us during this series. And like so many of our clients and our partners, we had to pivot almost instantly, and we had a 48-hour pivot and suddenly took 150 briefings across Australia, New Zealand and Singapore online. And that couldn't have been possible without the support of the CommBank, IBM, Red Hat, ServiceNow, and of course many of our technology partners. So thank you for believing in us. You can see that we are trying very hard to keep you connected, and we're doing some really surprising work in our own right, and surprising ourselves that how quickly, when you have to, you can pivot. So really thank you for the support. So here in front of us, we have the results. So 81% are feeling innovative. The government is doing 100%. Wow, that's great. We're happy to hear that. And we're happy to hear that everyone's out there happy. So we're looking at 12 months. That changes sometimes, which is interesting. And so great that 95% of you enjoyed the event today and it met your objectives. So thank you for being with us. I'm going to hand over to you, Anna, to have the last word.
Oh, okay. Okay. My last word would be, people often, as you've just done, Tanya, commented that I seem to end up in crises a lot. I'd like to say that I don't think it's a causal relationship, but I have spent, I feel, a lot of my working life running towards the fire. And I think that isn't just coincidental. I am actively and, professionally satisfied by things that present big challenges. So, one of my, and you'll hear it a lot, but I think it's important, never waste a crisis. It will learn, it will stretch you. You will learn things about yourself that will be incredibly useful in other environments. But it's also, out of every crisis, there's opportunities to innovate, to think differently. And I think this one is going to be a real opportunity in all of those respects once we get out of this part of it. So good luck with all of those opportunities, folks.
Thank you. And thank you again for everyone. Bye. See you.